Emma jolted awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. That sound, a deep, thunderous growl vibrating through the stillness of the Montana night, wasn't part of her dream. The digital clock cast an eerie red glow. 17 a.m. Another growl, closer now, sent ice through her veins. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers when a massive silhouette rose at the foot of her bed. Shadow, but not the awkward, gangly pup they'd brought home 3 months ago. This creature stood tall, muscles rippling beneath its dark coat, ears erect and focused on her bedroom window. The scrape of fingernails against glass cut through the silence. A human shadow darted across the moonlit yard. Shadow's growl transformed into something primal, ancestral, a warning that froze both Emma and the retreating figure outside. The dog's amber eyes reflected something wild, something her father had repeatedly assured her was impossible. "Dad!" Emma whispered hoarsely, unable to look away from Shadow's transformed silhouette. "What's happening to our puppy?" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The Millers hadn't always lived on the outskirts of Pinewood, Montana. 2 years ago, they'd been a typical suburban family in Colorado until Ethan's final deployment changed everything. At 42, Master Sergeant Ethan Miller returned home with a Purple Heart, a medical discharge, and nightmares that made him scream in the darkness. The loss of his military canine partner, Duke, during an ambush had left wounds deeper than the shrapnel that tore through his right leg. Sarah Miller watched her husband deteriorate with each passing month. As a veterinary nurse, she understood trauma in both animals and humans. But helping Ethan proved more challenging than her most difficult cases. Her once vibrant husband now spent hours staring out windows, flinching at car backfires, and missing the loyal companion who'd saved his life twice before being killed in action. Their daughter Emma had her own demons. 8 years prior, a neighbor's Rottweiler had cornered and attacked her, leaving physical scars that had faded and emotional ones that hadn't, despite countless therapy sessions. The 16-year-old still crossed streets to avoid passing dogs and woke from nightmares of snarling teeth. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Both her husband and daughter were haunted by trauma, one from losing a dog, the other from encountering one. The move to rural Montana had been Ethan's idea. Clean air, open space, quiet, he'd said. The only enthusiasm he'd shown in months. Their modest farmhouse sat on 5 acres, bordered by pine forest on one side, and their nearest neighbor a half-mile down the winding dirt road. Ethan's military pension and Sarah's part-time work at the local animal clinic kept them afloat, if just barely. When Ethan first mentioned adopting a German Shepherd puppy, both Sarah and Emma had balked. "It might help me," he'd said quietly over dinner, the unspoken plea in his eyes breaking Sarah's resolve. Emma had remained adamant until the night she found her father sobbing in the garage, clutching Duke's worn leather collar. "Maybe it would help, Dad," she'd whispered to her mother later, though her hands trembled at the thought of a dog, any dog, living under their roof. What none of them could have anticipated was how profoundly Shadow would change their lives, or the secrets that would unfold with his mysterious transformation. The Pine Valley Animal Shelter sat at the end of a rutted gravel road, its weathered sign barely visible among overgrown bushes. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter as they approached, trying to ignore the tension radiating from Emma in the back seat. Ethan stared straight ahead, his jaw set with determination. "This place gives me the creeps," Emma muttered, eyeing the chain-link kennels that stretched behind the main building. "Why couldn't we go to that shelter in Bridgeton instead?" "Because they didn't have German Shepherds," Ethan replied, his voice softening. "And Frank at the VFW said this place specializes in working breeds, military dogs." Sometimes. Sarah parked beside the only other vehicle, a mud-splattered pickup truck. Let's just take a look. No pressure. Right. She squeezed Emma's hand, feeling it cold and stiff in her own. The shelter's interior smelled of disinfectant and wet fur. A tall, angular woman emerged from a back room at the sound of the bell. The Millers? Her sharp eyes assessed them quickly. I'm Marlene Vickers. I understand you're interested in one of our shepherd pups. Yes, ma'am. Ethan stood straighter, almost at attention, specifically for therapeutic purposes. Marlene nodded knowingly. Former military? Yes. Ma'am, Army. Something flickered in Marlene's expression. I might have exactly what you need. She led them through a corridor of kennels where various dogs barked and whined for attention. Emma trailed several steps behind, hands jammed in her pockets. At the far end, in an isolated pen, a black and tan puppy sat quietly watching their approach. Unlike the other dogs, he made no sound, his amber eyes tracking each person with unusual intensity. This is our special boy, Marlene said, about 12 weeks old. His mother was a purebred German shepherd who came to us pregnant. Very intelligent breeding line. Ethan knelt, despite his stiff leg. The puppy approached cautiously, sniffed his outstretched hand, then pressed his head against Ethan's palm. Sarah hadn't seen her husband smile like that in years. What about the father? Sarah asked. Professional curiosity piqued. Marlene shrugged. Unknown, but given the pup's characteristics, likely another shepherd or similar breed. The adoption process moved with surprising speed. Marlene produced paperwork that seemed excessive for a shelter adoption, including an unusual contract that prohibited DNA testing or breeding. Standard for dogs with potential service backgrounds, she explained when Sarah questioned it. As they prepared to leave, Marlene crouched to the puppy's level. You're special, she whispered, just loud enough for Emma to overhear. You'll know what to do. That night, the newly named Shadow explored the farmhouse with methodical precision, ignoring the plush bed Sarah had prepared. Instead, settling on the floor beside Ethan's side of the bed, the veteran slept soundly for the first time in months, while Emma lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sound of paws moving through her home, wondering what special really meant. 6 weeks after bringing Shadow home, Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway with a measuring tape dangling from her fingers, watching Ethan feed the dog that had become the center of their household routine. Ethan, she said carefully. He's grown 3 inches in a month. That's not normal. Ethan glanced up, defensive. Shepherds are large dogs. He's just hitting a growth spurt. Not like this. Sarah crossed her arms. I've worked with hundreds of puppies. At 5 months, he's the size of a fully grown male. And look at his paws, they're still oversized. He's nowhere near done growing. Shadow sat at perfect attention, his amber eyes following their conversation with unnerving comprehension. His puppy clumsiness had vanished, replaced by a fluid, powerful grace that reminded Sarah of the wild wolves she'd once observed at Yellowstone. His coat had darkened, too, the tan markings now barely visible against midnight black fur. He's just a big dog, Ethan insisted, but Sarah caught the uncertainty in his voice. That afternoon, Tom Reeves from the neighboring property appeared at their fence line, rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. Need to talk about that animal you're keeping, he called as Ethan walked out to meet him. Something wrong, Tom? Ethan's posture stiffened. My cattle are spooked. Found tracks by the creek that don't belong to any dog. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Some folks are saying you're keeping a wolf hybrid. That's illegal in this county without proper permits." "Shadow's a German shepherd," Ethan replied flatly. "Nothing more." Tom glanced toward the house where Shadow watched from the window, unnaturally still. "German shepherds don't grow that big that fast. Miller, I've had 3 in my lifetime." The conversation ended in tense disagreement, but 3 days later, Sheriff Coleman's patrol car rolled up their driveway. By then, Shadow weighed nearly 90 pounds, his shoulders reaching Ethan's hip. "Got reports of wolf sightings in the area," the sheriff said after declining Sarah's offer of coffee. "And some concerns about your new pet." "He's a German shepherd," Sarah and Ethan said almost in unison. Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly. "Mind if I take a look at him?" Shadow appeared in the doorway as if summoned, standing tall, ears erect. The sheriff let out a low whistle. "That's one hell of a dog." "He's still growing," Emma said from behind them, her former fear now replaced with fierce protectiveness. Over the weeks, she and Shadow had formed an unexpected bond, the dog somehow sensing her boundaries, never jumping or making sudden movements around her. After the sheriff left with a warning to keep that animal secured, Sarah pulled out Shadow's adoption paperwork. Something had been nagging at her inconsistencies in the vaccination records Marlene had provided. "Ethan," she called from their home office, "these records are falsified." Her husband looked over her shoulder at the documents, confusion creasing his brow. "How can you tell?" "The clinic listed doesn't exist. I called to verify the rabies vaccine batch number." Sarah pointed to other discrepancies. "And look at the birth date. It keeps changing between documents. If these were accurate, Shadow would be almost a year old, not 5 months." That night, Ethan's nightmares returned with new intensity. Sarah woke to his thrashing, crying out Duke's name. Shadow, who now slept at the foot of their bed despite his size, stood alert, watching Ethan with that same penetrating gaze. As Ethan's nightmare peaked, Shadow placed his massive paw on the veteran's chest and pressed gently. Immediately, Ethan's breathing slowed. His features relaxed. Sarah watched in astonishment as her husband settled back into peaceful sleep. Shadow maintaining his vigilant position, the dog turned to meet her eyes, and in the dim light, Sarah could have sworn those amber orbs held a wisdom and purpose no ordinary animal should possess. "What are you?" she whispered. Shadow offered no answer, but the question lingered in Sarah's mind the next morning when she found enormous paw prints circling their property, a perfect perimeter patrol, and realized their gate had been unlatched and resecured. Something impossible for a dog to manage, no matter how intelligent. Emma's transformation happened so gradually that at first, even she didn't notice. The girl who once crossed streets to avoid passing dogs now walked confidently with a 100-pound Shadow at her side, his leash loose in her hand. On this crisp October morning, they made their way down Pinewood's main street, drawing the usual stares and whispers. "That's not a dog," she overheard Mrs. Wu Whitaker mutter to the pharmacist. "I've seen wolves at Yellowstone smaller than that beast." Emma's grip tightened on the leash, but Shadow remained perfectly composed, his gait smooth and controlled despite the power evident in each step. 3 months ago, such comments would have sent her spiraling into anxiety. Now, they ignited a protective indignation. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Emma called with deliberate cheerfulness. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She continued past the startled woman, Shadow's warm presence against her leg, a silent reassurance. The change hadn't happened overnight. It began with Shadow's intuitive understanding of her fear. Unlike other dogs who seemed oblivious to her discomfort, Shadow had approached her with careful calculation those first weeks, always maintaining distance until she initiated contact. He slept outside her bedroom door, never inside, as if standing guard against her nightmares. The turning point came a month after his arrival. Emma had been walking home from the school bus stop when Tyler Reeves, their neighbor's son, roared past on his dirt bike. Deliberately swerving close enough to spray gravel, she'd stumbled into the ditch, scraping her palms. Shadow, who had taken to meeting her at the end of their long driveway, appeared seconds later. He assessed her injuries with an almost human concern, then looked toward Tyler's retreating figure. "It's okay," she told him, dusting herself off. "Just Tyler being a jerk." The next day, when Tyler tried the same stunt, Shadow was waiting. One commanding bark, deeper than seemed possible, sent the boy veering wildly before toppling into the opposite ditch. Shadow hadn't moved a muscle beyond that warning. But the message was clear. Emma was under his protection. After that, she began taking him everywhere the town's increasingly restrictive attitude would allow. Shadow's presence gave her a confidence she'd never known, and in return, she defended him against the growing murmurs of the community. The tension in Pinewood escalated when Farmer Johnston's prize sheep were killed one night. Though the attacks bore clear signs of coyotes confirmed by the county wildlife officer, many fingers pointed at Shadow. "That animal has predator written all over it," Tom Reeves declared at an impromptu gathering at the town's only diner. "Have you seen the size of it? No domestic dog grows that big." Ethan stood alone against the room of suspicious faces. "Shadow doesn't leave our property unattended. He's either with me, my daughter, or secured at home." "How can you be sure?" Johnston demanded. "That fence of yours wouldn't hold something determined to get out." The accusation stung because Sarah had recently discovered Shadow could indeed open latches, a fact they'd kept private. They had installed more secure locks on gates and doors, not to keep Shadow in, but because his intelligence increasingly unnerved them. Meanwhile, as the community's suspicion grew, so did the frequency of Ethan's night terrors. Sarah often woke to find her husband drenched in sweat, muttering about ambush scenarios that blended his actual experiences with new, fabricated horrors. What mystified her was Shadow's response. The dog would position himself beside Ethan, sometimes applying gentle pressure with his body until the veteran calmed. It was as if Shadow recognized the symptoms of PTSD and instinctively provided the grounding techniques Ethan's therapist had recommended. "He's doing exactly what service dogs are trained for," she commented one morning after a particularly rough night. Ethan stared into his coffee. "But we haven't trained him to do any of this. He just knows." The mystery deepened when Richard Grayson arrived in Pinewood. The wildlife management officer had been sent to investigate the sheep killings, but his interest quickly shifted to the Millers and their unusual pet. "Just routine questions," he assured them, standing on their porch, notepad in hand. "May I see the dog?" Shadow appeared at Ethan's side, his posture alert but not aggressive. Grayson's professional demeanor slipped for just a moment, a flash of recognition or surprise that he quickly masked. "German Shepherd. You said," he scribbled in his notepad. "Mind if I take a few measurements? Standard procedure for ruling out wild animals in livestock predation cases." Though reluctant, Ethan allowed it. Shadow stood perfectly still as Grayson measured his height at the shoulder, length, and skull dimensions. "Extraordinary specimen," the officer murmured. "Where did you acquire him?" When told about the Pine Valley shelter, Grayson frowned. "Interesting. I'm not familiar with that facility." And I've worked with most rescue operations in the state." After he left, Sarah voiced what they were all thinking. He wasn't here about the sheep that evening. As Sarah sorted through Shadow's documents again, she discovered a sealed envelope she'd previously overlooked, tucked into the accordion folder Marlene had provided. Inside was a single page of what appeared to be military letterhead, most of it redacted with thick black lines. Only a few phrases remained visible. Project Sentinel, enhanced capabilities, and handler compatibility essential. "Ethan," she called, her voice unsteady. "What does this mean?" Her husband studied the paper, his expression darkening. "It looks like, but it can't be." He ran his hand through his graying hair. "There were rumors about specialized training programs for military dogs. Some said they were breeding for specific traits, intelligence, size, instinct. Duke was part of the early trials." "You never mentioned that," Sarah said. "Most of it was classified, and frankly, the results were mixed. Duke was exceptional, but not because of any program. He was just Duke." Ethan's voice cracked on his former partner's name. Later that night, Emma found Shadow sitting by the window, watching the tree line with unusual intensity. "What do you see, boy?" she whispered, joining him. The moonlight cast his silhouette in sharp relief, highlighting how much he'd changed from the gangly puppy they'd brought home. His head now reached her chest when he stood, his shoulders broad and powerful, his movements possessing a fluid precision that seemed almost choreographed. She'd been secretly working with him, teaching commands and tricks far more complex than typical dog training. Shadow learned with astonishing speed, often anticipating the next step before she demonstrated it. Sometimes, when they practiced alone in the back field, Emma caught glimpses of abilities that defied explanation. His incredible leaps, his ability to track scents days old, the way he seemed to anticipate her thoughts. "You're special," she told him, echoing Marlene's words from months ago. "But I don't care why or how. You're ours now." Shadow turned from the window and pressed his massive head against her chest, a gesture of affection that had become their ritual. But tonight he pulled back suddenly, returning his attention to the darkness outside. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it?" Emma peered into the night but saw nothing. Shadow's behavior grew increasingly vigilant over the next few days. He patrolled the property boundaries relentlessly, especially at night. Twice, Ethan found him standing at the edge of the forest, hackles raised, staring into the darkness as if challenging something unseen. "Maybe he's sensing the coyotes," Sarah suggested. But her tone lacked conviction. The situation came to a head when Sheriff Coleman returned, this time with Richard Grayson and 2 county officials. "We've had a formal complaint," the sheriff explained awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with his role. "Several neighbors have signed a petition expressing concerns about—" He glanced at his paperwork. "A potentially dangerous wild animal hybrid being kept within township limits." "That's ridiculous," Ethan protested. "Shadow's a dog, maybe an unusually large one, but still a dog." Grayson stepped forward. "Mr. Miller, we have reason to believe your animal may be a wolf-dog hybrid of significant wolf content. Such animals are regulated under state law. We'll need to conduct DNA testing to determine his status." "And if we refuse," Sarah asked, "then we'd be forced to impound the animal until the matter is resolved legally," one of the county officials stated flatly. "For public safety." The threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. Emma, who had been listening from the hallway, burst into the room. "You can't take him. He hasn't done anything wrong." Shadow followed close behind her, his demeanor calm despite the tension, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. When he positioned himself between Emma and the visitors, the officials took involuntary steps backward. "See?" one muttered. "That's not normal dog behavior." "Actually," Ethan countered, drawing on his military experience, "that's exactly what a well-trained protection dog does: assess threats and position accordingly. Shadow's doing what he was bred to do." After tense negotiations, they reached a compromise. Shadow would be registered as a potential hybrid, subject to proper containment requirements. While DNA testing was arranged, the officials left with samples of Shadow's fur and stern warnings about liability. That night, as the family processed the day's events over dinner, the true complexity of their situation became clear. They'll take him away if he's classified as high-content wolf hybrid, Sarah said quietly. "The regulations are extremely strict." "But he's not dangerous," Emma insisted. "He's never shown aggression except when protecting us." Ethan had been unusually quiet, turning the redacted document over in his mind. What if Shadow is something else entirely? Not a wolf hybrid, but something purpose-bred. "Like what?" Sarah asked. "I don't know for certain, but in Afghanistan, there were special dog teams with capabilities beyond standard military working dogs, enhanced sensory perception, problem-solving abilities, even what some handlers swore was tactical awareness." He sighed heavily. "Duke showed some of those traits after certain training protocols. Shadow displays all of them naturally." The conversation was interrupted by Shadow suddenly rising from his spot near Emma, ears forward, body tense. A low, warning growl emerged from deep in his chest as he moved to the front window. Outside, headlights swept across their property as a vehicle pulled slowly down their driveway, then stopped, its lights extinguishing. Shadow's growl deepened. "Were we expecting anyone?" Sarah asked, moving to peer through the curtains. Before anyone could answer, Shadow began barking urgently, not his usual alert bark, but something commanding and insistent. He raced to Emma, tugging at her sleeve, then to the back door. "I think he wants us to leave," she said, alarm rising in her voice. Ethan's military instincts kicked in. "Grab emergency supplies. Now." As the family rushed to gather essentials, Shadow's behavior grew more agitated. When they hesitated at the back door, unsure where to go, Shadow took the lead, guiding them toward the old storm cellar they rarely used. They had barely secured themselves inside when they heard the front door of their home splinter open. Heavy footsteps moved through the house, accompanied by harsh whispers. Shadow stood at the cellar entrance, his massive form a silhouette against the night sky, watching, waiting, protecting the family that had become his own, a family now realizing that the mystery of their extraordinary dog was far deeper than they had imagined. Montana winters arrived without warning. One day the hills were painted in autumn gold, the next they disappeared beneath a shroud of white. This particular storm had stranded the Millers for 3 days, their driveway impassable, power lines sagging under the weight of ice. On the 4th morning, Ethan stood at the kitchen window, watching Shadow patrol the property perimeter, his black coat stark against the endless white. "He's been restless all night," Sarah remarked, joining her husband with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The kerosene lamps cast long shadows across the kitchen, their emergency generator providing just enough electricity for essential appliances. "He senses something," Ethan replied, accepting the coffee. His military instincts, dormant for years, had awakened fully since the break-in attempt 3 weeks earlier. though they'd found nothing missing. The violation had left them all on edge. The sheriff had taken a report but seemed skeptical, suggesting teenagers might have been responsible. Ethan knew better. The precision of the entry, the careful search pattern visible in the disturbance of their belongings, these were not the actions of vandals. "Mom," Emma called from the living room where she'd been trying to complete homework by lamplight. "The landline's working again." Sarah moved to test the phone just as it rang, the shrill sound startling in the quiet house. She answered, her expression shifting from relief to confusion. "It's Richard Grayson," she whispered to Ethan, covering the receiver. "He wants to come by. Says it's urgent." Ethan took the phone. "We're snowed in. Grayson, the driveway hasn't been plowed. I have a vehicle that can manage." The wildlife officer replied, his tone unusually tense. "Miller, this can't wait. It's about Shadow's DNA results. And about who broke into your house." An hour later, the distant sound of an engine laboring through snow announced Grayson's arrival. Shadow positioned himself between the door and Emma, his posture alert but not aggressive. When Grayson stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, Shadow's reaction was immediate. A low, warning rumble that stopped the wildlife officer in his tracks. "Easy," Ethan commanded, though he noticed Grayson's hand drift toward his hip, where a service weapon would typically rest. Grayson's eyes never left Shadow. "Miller, that is not a standard German Shepherd." "We've established that," Sarah replied coolly. "What did the tests show?" Grayson removed his heavy coat, his movements deliberately slow. "Not what anyone expected. Your dog is technically not a wolf hybrid, which is why the county regulations don't apply." He paused. "Shadow is a specialized breed developed through a classified breeding program for military applications. Specifically, a program I used to oversee before complications arose." The room fell silent, save for the howling wind outside. Shadow's gaze remained fixed on Grayson, unblinking, assessing. "The break-in at your property wasn't random," Grayson continued. "The shelter where you adopted Shadow Pine Valley isn't a legitimate rescue operation. It's a front for someone who's been stealing specialized military working dogs and their offspring, selling them to private security firms, foreign interests, anyone willing to pay." "Marlene," Sarah whispered. Grayson nodded. "Real name, Marlene Vickers Doyle, former military dog handler who was discharged after ethical violations. She's been tracking Shadow since you adopted him." "Why?" Emma asked, her hand resting protectively on Shadow's back. "Because he's valuable. Extraordinarily so." Grayson pulled out a manila folder. "And because Shadow is the result of a breeding program that technically doesn't exist on paper, a program to develop canines with enhanced instincts, intelligence, and physical capabilities." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "You expect us to believe Shadow is some kind of super dog? I expect you to believe your own eyes. Miller, you've lived with him for months. Tell me he's normal." Grayson's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'm not here to take him. Quite the opposite. I'm here to warn you." He laid out surveillance photos on the kitchen table, images of Marlene meeting with two men in an unmarked van. Satellite images of the Miller property with entry points marked. "She's planning something, and the storm gives her perfect cover. County emergency services are overwhelmed. Sheriff's Department is responding to accidents on the interstate. You're isolated out here." Ethan studied the photos, military training kicking in. "How do we know we can trust you?" Grayson met his gaze steadily. "Because I was Duke's first handler before he was reassigned to you." The revelation hit Ethan like physical blow. That's impossible. I would have known. Not if the information was compartmentalized. Duke was part of the early program successful, but not to the degree Shadow represents. Different genetics, different capabilities. Grayson knelt slowly, extending his hand toward Shadow. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Shadow approached, sniffing Grayson's hand before allowing a brief touch to his head. He recognizes handler-sent templates. Grayson explained. Anyone who's worked with the program carries specific markers. Emma's eyes widened. Is that why he bonded with Dad so quickly? Grayson nodded. Your father worked with Duke. Shadow would recognize similarities in scent and behavior patterns. The conversation halted abruptly as Shadow's head snapped toward the window, his hackles raised, a low growl building in his chest. "They're here," Grayson whispered, drawing a handgun from beneath his coat. "Positions we discussed earlier. Miller, secure the back door. Mrs. Miller, take Emma to the inner room. No lights." The family moved with practiced efficiency. Ethan's military drills transformed into household protocol after the first break-in attempt. Shadow remained by the window, his muscular frame tense, eyes tracking movement only he could detect through the swirling snow. The first attempt at entry came through the cellar door, a muffled crashing followed by heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs. Ethan waited in the darkened kitchen, Grayson's borrowed shotgun cold in his hands. The door connecting cellar to kitchen eased open, revealing a masked figure who froze at the sight of Shadow materialized from the shadows. Teeth bared in silent warning, the intruder reached for a weapon. But Shadow was faster, 130 pounds of muscle launching across the room. The man went down with a strangled cry. Shadow's jaw locked around his arm, with precise pressure enough to immobilize without severing arteries. Simultaneously, glass shattered in the living room as a second intruder forced entry through a window. Grayson intercepted this one, the brief struggle ending with the intruder pinned face down. "Clear," Ethan called out, military protocol resurfacing as he secured the first man's weapon. Emma's scream shattered the momentary victory. A third intruder, Marlene herself, had entered through Emma's bedroom window and now held the girl with a knife pressed to her throat. "Call off your dog," she ordered, backing toward the front door with Emma as shield. "And you, Grayson, weapon down." Shadow released his captive at Ethan's command but remained coiled, ready to spring. His eyes never left Marlene and Emma, calculating, assessing angles and distances. "You know what he is?" Marlene continued, her voice eerily calm. "Worth millions to the right buyer. Military application. Private security. Imagine what cartels would pay for dogs like him." "He's a dog, not a weapon," Sarah said, emerging from the hallway shadows. "And that's our daughter." "Collateral," Marlene replied coldly. "I'm leaving with the dog. The girl ensures you let me." The standoff stretched in tense silence, broken only by the howling wind. Shadow's gaze shifted between Emma and Ethan, as if seeking instruction. "Shadow, stay," Ethan commanded finally, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. The massive dog obeyed, but his muscles trembled with restrained energy. Marlene began edging toward the door, dragging Emma with her. "Smart choice. Once I'm clear, you'll get your daughter back." "Don't count on it," Grayson muttered, his weapon still lowered but ready. What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Emma, drawing on months of observation, mimicked the hand signal Ethan used for Shadow's release command. Shadow exploded into motion, not toward Marlene and Emma, but toward the overhead lamp suspended above them. His powerful leap brought down the fixture, plunging that section of room into darkness. In the confusion, Emma dropped and rolled as she'd practiced with Shadow during their secret training sessions. Marlene's knife slashed air where Emma had been. Before she could recover, Shadow was between them, his body a physical barrier protecting the girl. When Marlene lunged forward, Shadow countered with precision, teeth closing around her wrist. Applying exactly enough pressure to force the knife from her grip, Grayson and Ethan moved simultaneously, securing Marlene as Shadow maintained his hold. Only when Emma was safely in Sarah's arms did the dog release his captive, backing away with a vigilance that suggested he understood the threat wasn't fully neutralized. "He could have killed you," Ethan told Marlene as he zip-tied her wrists. "He chose not to." The aftermath was chaos of emergency lights and official vehicles. Once the storm abated enough for Grayson's backup to arrive, the three intruders were taken into custody, charged with attempted kidnapping, breaking and entering, and a host of other offenses that would keep them imprisoned for decades. As dawn broke, Emma sat on the porch steps, Shadow's massive head in her lap. Despite the night's violence, the dog appeared calm, his eyes half closed in contentment as she stroked his ears. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "All along, you knew you were different." Shadow's amber eyes met hers with that uncanny intelligence that had become familiar over the months. He wasn't just a dog. He was something bred for extraordinary purpose. Yet in this moment, he was simply her companion, her protector, her shadow. Inside, Ethan and Grayson spoke in hushed tones about the future, about Shadow's status, about the program that had created him, about the legal complications that would inevitably follow. Sarah moved between them, gathering broken glass, trying to restore normalcy to their violated home. The storm was passing, revealing a transformed landscape, pristine white, covering the scars of violence. As the sun broke through heavy clouds, Shadow raised his head suddenly, ears forward, attention fixed on the tree line where something moved in the distance. A moment later, he settled back into Emma's lap, apparently satisfied that whatever he had detected posed no threat to his family, the family he had chosen, the family he had protected, the family who now understood that their extraordinary dog was both more and less than they had imagined, a creature of purpose finding his own path in a world that sought to use his gifts for darker ends. The veterinary clinic in Bridgeton was 30 miles from the Miller property, a journey made treacherous by half-plowed roads and black ice. Sarah drove with white-knuckled concentration, while Emma sat in the back, Shadow's massive head cradled in her lap. The dog's breathing came in shallow pants, his normally alert eyes clouded with pain. "Stay with me," Emma whispered, applying pressure to the blood-soaked towel wrapped around Shadow's hindquarters. "Just a little longer." Boy, the attack had come at dawn, 48 hours after Marlene's arrest, while the family slept, exhausted from their ordeal. Someone had broken the new lock on the back gate. They might never have known if not for Shadow's vigilance. The dog had detected the intruder, likely one of Marlene's associates who hadn't been caught, and confronted them near the tree line. Ethan had woken to Shadow's warning bark, followed by a pained yelp that sent him bolting from bed. He'd found Shadow staggering back toward the house, a trail of blood stark against the snow. The intruder long gone, a knife wound sliced deep across Shadow's hip and back leg, the blade having found the vulnerable gap between muscle and bone. "We need to get him to Dr. Thornton," Sarah had said, already gathering emergency supplies. "This is beyond what I can handle here." Now, as they pulled into the clinic's parking lot, Ethan was already waiting, having driven ahead to ensure the veterinarian was prepared Dr. Helen Thornton, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had been treating the area's animals for decades, held the clinic door open as they carried Shadow inside on an improvised stretcher. "Examining room 1," she directed, eyeing the dog's size with professional assessment. "I've got blood ready for transfusion if needed. Sarah, you'll assist." As they transferred Shadow to the metal examination table, his eyes found Emma's, a whimper escaping as the movement jarred his wound. "I know it hurts," she soothed, tears streaming unchecked down her face. "But Dr. Thornton will fix you up. You'll need to wait outside, dear," the veterinarian said, already cutting away blood-soaked fur around the wound. "Your mother and I need space to work." Ethan gently pulled his daughter away. "Come on, Em, let's give them room." In the waiting area, Emma collapsed into a chair, her hands and jacket still covered in Shadow's blood. "This is my fault," she whispered. "How could it possibly be your fault?" Ethan sat beside her, his own face haggard with worry. "I've been taking him out at night," she confessed. "Training him when you and Mom were asleep. He was so smart, learned commands in minutes that would take other dogs weeks." She looked up, anguish plain on her face. "I posted videos online, nothing identifying our location. But someone might have recognized him." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Emma, I know it was stupid," her voice broke, "but I was so proud of him. I wanted to show people how amazing he is, that he's not dangerous or scary, and now he might die because of me." Ethan pulled her close, feeling her body shake with sobs. "Shadow's not going to die. He's the toughest dog I've ever known, and your mother is the best vet tech in 3 counties. The hours crawled by through the clinic's windows. They watched fresh snow begin to fall, erasing their tracks in the parking lot. Twice, Ethan called Grayson with updates, the wildlife officer promising to investigate the attack once road conditions improved. At noon, Sarah emerged from the examination room, surgical cap still on her head, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "The knife penetrated deep," she reported, sinking into a chair across from them. "Missed the femoral artery by millimeters, but did damage to the muscle. He's lost a lot of blood. But he'll live." Emma's voice was small. Sarah nodded slowly. "He's stabilized. But there's something else." She met Ethan's eyes. Helen found something embedded near his shoulder blade during the examination, a microchip, but not a standard identification type, military grade. "Grayson mentioned tracking capabilities," Ethan said quietly. "That's how they kept finding us." Helen removed it. "But—" Sarah hesitated. "Shadow's recovery is going to be complicated. The damage to his hip means he may never regain full function in that leg. He'll need extensive rehabilitation, possibly surgeries." Emma's face crumpled. "He saved us, all of us, and now he's suffering because of it. There's more." Sarah continued reluctantly. "The county officials called while we were in surgery. With Marlene's arrest and the evidence from the break-in, they're classifying Shadow as a specialized service animal rather than a pet or wolf hybrid. But that comes with restrictions." "What kind of restrictions?" Ethan asked. "Military oversight, potential reassignment if they determine he's needed elsewhere." Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "They're sending representatives next week to evaluate him." Emma's head snapped up. "They can't take him. He's ours." "Legally, it's complicated," Sarah admitted. "If Shadow was part of a classified breeding program, as Grayson says, the government might claim ownership." The conversation halted as Dr. Thornton appeared, wiping her hands on a towel. He's awake, asking for you, in his way, one visitor at a time. Please." Emma was on her feet instantly. "Can I?" The veterinarian nodded, holding the door open. 5 minutes. He needs rest. In the recovery area, Shadow lay on a padded table, an IV line taped to his foreleg, thick bandages wrapped around his hindquarters. His ears perked forward slightly at Emma's approach, but the usual alertness in his amber eyes was dimmed by pain and medication. "Hey, boy," she whispered, gently stroking his head. "I'm so sorry." Shadow made a feeble attempt to lift his head, his tail thumping weakly against the table. Despite his condition, he seemed determined to show he recognized her, that their bond remained unbroken. Emma carefully leaned down, wrapping her arms around his neck in the gentlest of hugs. "You have to get better. Okay? We won't let them take you away. I promise." When her time was up, Ethan took his turn. The veteran stood for a long moment just watching the dog's labored breathing, memories of Duke overlaying the present, another loyal partner injured in the line of duty. "You did good, soldier," he said finally, his voice gruff with emotion. "Rest now. That's an order." Shadow's eyes met his, and in that moment, Ethan felt a connection that transcended the ordinary relationship between man and dog. Whatever Shadow was, enhanced military asset, specialized breed, or simply an extraordinary animal, he had become family in the truest sense. Later, as night fell and visiting hours ended, the Millers reluctantly prepared to leave. Dr. Thornton assured them Shadow would receive round-the-clock monitoring, with Sarah permitted to return in the morning to assist with his care. "He's remarkably resilient," the older veterinarian noted. "The amount of blood loss would have killed most dogs his size, but he's stabilizing faster than I expected, almost as if he's conditioned for trauma response." In the car, driving back to their empty home, Emma stared out at the darkening landscape. "What if they take him away?" she asked finally, voicing the fear that had been building since Sarah's revelation. "We won't let that happen," Ethan replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "But if Shadow really was bred for military work, if that's what he was made for, maybe that's where he belongs." Emma's voice broke. "Maybe we're being selfish." Sarah reached back to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Shadow has made his choice clear. Sweetheart, whatever he was bred for, he's chosen to be your protector, our family guardian. The question is whether we're strong enough to fight for his choice." At home, the house felt eerily quiet without Shadow's reassuring presence. The blood trail in the snow had been obliterated by fresh powder, but evidence of the attack remained in the damaged gate. The trampled garden beds, in Shadow's bed. Emma found one of his toys, a rope knot frayed from powerful jaws, and carried it to her room. That night, as she finally drifted toward exhausted sleep, Emma made herself a solemn promise. No matter what authorities or agencies might claim, no matter what papers or regulations they produced, Shadow would remain where he belonged. With his family, with her, the alternative was unthinkable. 3 days after Shadow's surgery, Colonel James Lancaster arrived at the Bridgeton Veterinary Clinic in an unmarked black SUV, tall and imposing in his civilian clothes. The military bearing was unmistakable as he strode through the waiting room, ignoring the curious glances from other pet owners. At the reception desk, he presented credentials that sent the young assistant scurrying to find Dr. Thornton. In the recovery ward, oblivious to the newcomer's arrival, Emma sat cross-legged on the floor beside Shadow's kennel, reading aloud from Call of the Wild. She'd been coming daily after school, staying until closing time, Her homework spread around her, as she maintained a constant stream of conversation with the recovering dog. Shadow lay with his head near the kennel door, eyes alert despite the pain medication, his attention fixed on Emma as if understanding every word. "His recovery is remarkable," Dr. Thornton was saying as she led Colonel Lancaster into the ward. "I've never seen tissue regeneration at this rate. The wound is healing cleanly, with minimal scarring." Emma looked up, instantly wary of the stranger in the pressed khakis and polo shirt. Shadow's ears pricked forward, his body tensing despite his injury. "Emma Miller." The man extended his hand. "Colonel James Lancaster, United States Army. I need to speak with your parents about Shadow." "They're in the consultation room with Dr. Thornton," Emma replied, not taking his hand. "I'm staying with Shadow." The colonel nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Of course. I'll come back after I've spoken with them." In the small consultation room, Ethan stood as Lancaster entered, recognizing military authority even in civilian clothes. Sarah remained seated, her expression guarded. "Master Sergeant Miller," Lancaster acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Miller, thank you for meeting me. I understand this is a difficult time for your family." "With all due respect, Colonel," Ethan replied, "what exactly is your interest in our dog?" Lancaster placed a leather briefcase on the table, removing several folders. "I'm here representing Joint Special Operations Command's K-9 Division, specifically the Advanced Canine Development Program." He slid a document toward them. "What you're looking at is a partially declassified summary of Project Sentinel, which developed specialized working dogs with enhanced capabilities for military applications." Sarah scanned the document, her veterinary training allowing her to understand the technical terminology: selective breeding for cognitive processing, physical adaptability, and handler bonding. She read aloud, "This is talking about Shadow." "Not explicitly," Lancaster admitted. "But yes, your dog is one of 17 successful outcomes from the third generation of the program. His designation was S317. He turned to Ethan. "You're familiar with military working dogs. Sergeant, Shadow represents the pinnacle of what can be achieved through specialized breeding and early development protocols. He's not a weapon," Ethan said flatly. "He's our family dog." Lancaster's expression remained neutral. "No one is suggesting he's a weapon, Sergeant, but he is government property. Technically speaking, his presence in civilian hands was never authorized." Sarah's face flushed with anger. "So you're here to take him?" "I'm here to assess the situation," Lancaster corrected. Marlene Vickers Doyle's theft of program assets created a complicated scenario. Normally, these dogs remain within military control their entire lives. "What makes Shadow so special?" Ethan asked. "Beyond being well-trained and intelligent," Lancaster hesitated, then appeared to make a decision. He slid another document across the table, this one containing photographs. "This is Shadow's mother, Athena. She was part of the second generation of the program, deployed in Afghanistan and Syria. 27 confirmed saves of military personnel. Your former partner, Duke, was her littermate." Ethan stared at the photograph of a German shepherd with the same intense amber eyes as Shadow. "Duke died saving my unit during an ambush." "No, Sergeant. Duke was severely injured but survived." Lancaster's revelation fell like a bomb in the quiet room. He was evacuated for treatment and later integrated into the breeding program due to his exceptional field performance. Shadow is Duke's offspring. Ethan sank back into his chair, the implications washing over him. Duke is alive, and he's Shadow's father. "Yes," The genetic connection explains the immediate bond Shadow formed with you. Our dogs are conditioned to recognize handler scent markers across generations. Lancaster cleared his throat. It also explains why Shadow has demonstrated such extraordinary protective behaviors toward your family, particularly your daughter. Sarah leaned forward, professional curiosity momentarily overriding her concern. The intelligence, the problem-solving ability that's all by design, enhanced natural traits through selective breeding. Lancaster confirmed. No genetic modification. If that's your concern, these are dogs. Mrs. Miller, exceptional dogs, but still fundamentally canines. The consultation room door opened, and Emma slipped inside, her expression defiant. Shadow heard raised voices. He's getting agitated. Lancaster regarded her thoughtfully. You've formed quite a bond with him. He saved my life, Emma stated simply, more than once. And you want to take him away. Emma, Sarah began. But Lancaster raised a hand. It's all right. Mrs. May Miller, your daughter deserves honesty. He turned to Emma. Shadow was bred for a specific purpose to work alongside special operations personnel in high-risk environments. He has instincts and abilities that make him exceptionally valuable to our program. He also has a family. Emma countered. Us. He chose us. A glimmer of respect showed in Lancaster's eyes. Walk with me to see him. Emma hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The adults followed as she led the way back to the recovery ward, where Shadow watched their approach with clear recognition. Despite his injured state, he struggled to stand when he saw Lancaster's uniform-like attire. At ease, soldier, Lancaster said quietly, kneeling to Shadow's level. The dog's posture relaxed marginally, though his eyes remained fixed on the colonel's every movement. Remarkable. He recognizes command structure even without formal training. He recognizes everything, Emma said. He understands conversations, emotions, intentions. He's not just some super dog, he's Shadow. Lancaster studied the interaction between girl and dog, noting the protective positioning, the subtle communications passing between them. May I? He asked. Gesturing toward the kennel latch, Emma hesitated, then nodded. Lancaster opened the kennel slowly and extended his hand, palm up, allowing Shadow to sniff. The dog's assessment was thorough, but he permitted the colonel's touch, though his body remained aligned toward Emma. Handler preference is clearly established, Lancaster observed, and the bond is unusually strong for an intact adult male. He looked at Ethan. Your daughter has become his primary handler. That's rare in our program. So what happens now? Sarah asked. You've seen him, assessed him. What's the verdict? Lancaster stood, brushing dog hair from his pants. Officially, Shadow remains a military asset. His training, breeding, and capabilities represent millions in development costs and years of research. He paused. Unofficially, extracting him from a family where he has clearly bonded would be counterproductive to everything we understand about these dogs. Meaning, Ethan pressed? Meaning I need to make some calls. Lancaster's expression remained unreadable. In the meantime, I'd like to explain some things about Shadow that might help with his recovery and future training, if you're amenable. The conversation moved to Dr. Thornton's office, where Lancaster outlined Shadow's developmental background, the specialized nutrition he required, training methodologies that would challenge his intelligence, and health considerations specific to his breeding. His wound recovery is accelerated compared to standard canines, he explained. a deliberate trait selected through the program, but he'll need careful rehabilitation to maintain full mobility in that leg. As the discussion progressed, Emma's initial hostility gradually thawed. Lancaster, for all his military rigidity, clearly respected Shadow as more than a simple asset. He shared stories of Athena, Shadow's mother, and of Duke's remarkable service record. "Your father's partner was a legend in the program," he told Emma. "Saved an entire squad during an ambush operation by leading them through a minefield. Dogs like Duke and Shadow have something beyond training, an intuitive understanding of threat assessment and human protection." "Is that why Shadow always seems to know when I'm upset?" Emma asked. "Even before I do sometimes," Lancaster nodded. "Emotional recognition is heightened in programmed dogs. They're selected for empathetic response alongside protective instincts." As evening approached, Lancaster prepared to leave. In the parking lot, he handed Ethan a business card with a private number handwritten on the back. "I'll advocate for Shadow to remain with your family, with certain conditions, ongoing training requirements, security protocols, periodic assessments." "And if your superiors disagree?" Sarah asked. Lancaster's expression tightened. "Let's hope they see the situation as I do. Shadow's capabilities are being utilized effectively here, protecting a family, bonding with a handler who understands him. Military objectives are still being met, just in a civilian context." After the colonel departed, the family returned to Shadow's side. The dog seemed subdued, as if sensing the weight of the conversation that had taken place. "What do you think will happen?" Emma asked. Stroking Shadow's head, Ethan sighed. "Best case, they let us keep him with oversight. Worst case, they don't." "We won't let them take him," Emma declared. "We'll run away, go somewhere. They can't find us." Sarah squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "I don't think it will come to that, sweetheart." Lancaster seemed reasonable, and Shadow's injury complicates matters in our favor. 2 days later, as the Millers prepared to bring Shadow home for continued recovery, Lancaster returned this time in full dress uniform, accompanied by a younger officer carrying a leather case. The sight sent Emma's heart plummeting. "They're taking him," she whispered to her mother as the men approached. Lancaster's expression revealed nothing as he greeted them. "The Miller family, thank you for meeting me again. I've spoken with my command about Shadow's situation." Emma moved protectively closer to Shadow, who sat obediently at her side despite his bandaged hindquarters, his gaze fixed on Lancaster. After review of all factors, the bond formed, the protection demonstrated, the unique circumstances of his placement with a veteran handler's family, a decision has been reached. Lancaster nodded to the junior officer, who opened the leather case. "Shadow is being officially redesignated as a military working dog assigned to civilian service." "What does that mean exactly?" Ethan asked cautiously. "It means, Sergeant Miller, that Shadow remains with your family, under your supervision." Lancaster removed documents from the case, with certain provisions: quarterly evaluations, specialized training continuation, security protocols for his protection. He handed the papers to Ethan. "Essentially, your family becomes his official handler unit." Emma's eyes widened. "So he stays with us for good, for the duration of his service life?" "Yes." Lancaster's formal demeanor softened slightly. "He's chosen his team. Ms. Miller. The military recognizes the value of that bond." The junior officer stepped forward with another item from the case, a specialized service vest with military insignia. "This identifies Shadow as a working dog under federal protection. It grants him access to locations normally restricted to pets and provides legal coverage under handler protection laws." As the implication sank in, Sarah asked the question on everyone's mind. Why this solution? Why not simply reclaim him? Lancaster considered her question carefully. Programmed dogs like Shadow form singular attachments. Breaking that bond can compromise everything they've been bred for. He glanced at Emma. Your daughter has somehow established primary handler status with one of our most advanced assets. That's not something we take lightly or something we're willing to disrupt. Before departing, Lancaster knelt to Shadow's level once more, meeting those intelligent amber eyes. Serve well, soldier, he said quietly. Your new mission is just as important as any battlefield deployment. Shadow's posture straightened imperceptibly, a subtle acknowledgment that seemed to satisfy the colonel. That evening, as Shadow settled into his bed at home for the first time since the attack, the family gathered in the living room, the gravity of the day's revelations still sinking in. Do you think they told us everything? Sarah wondered aloud. About what makes Shadow so special? Probably not, Ethan admitted. Military classification being what it is. Emma sat on the floor beside Shadow, gently stroking his healing flank. It doesn't matter. We know what's important. He's ours, and we're his. As if understanding her words, Shadow lifted his head and placed it in her lap, his amber eyes conveying a depth of connection that transcended ordinary explanations. In that moment, the mystery of his origins seemed less important than the certainty of his place in their lives. Extraordinary dog, loyal protector, beloved family member. Outside, snow began falling again, blanketing the property in pristine white, covering the last visible traces of the attack that had nearly separated them. Shadow's ears pricked forward briefly at a distant sound, then relaxed as he determined no threat existed. His family was safe, his position secured. Whatever purpose he had been bred for, he had found his true calling in the love of the humans who had given him not just a home, but a purpose beyond what any breeding program could have designed. 1 year later, the fresh spring air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers across the Miller property. The morning sun illuminated the renovated barn, now converted into a state-of-the-art training facility, where Emma stood in the center ring with Shadow at her side. At 18 months since his adoption, he had matured into a magnificent specimen, 140 pounds of disciplined power, his black coat gleaming with health, his amber eyes alert and focused solely on Emma. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Shadow's ears perked forward, his body tensing slightly in anticipation. "Find and secure," Emma commanded, her voice clear and confident. Shadow moved with astonishing speed, navigating the complex obstacle course designed by Colonel Lancaster's team. He scaled walls, ducked through tunnels, and located the hidden training dummy with methodical precision. Upon finding the target, he positioned himself protectively beside it, giving a single, sharp bark to signal completion. "Excellent work," called Ethan from the observation platform. His limp had improved with the physical therapy he'd begun 6 months ago, a journey inspired by Shadow's own rehabilitation. 7 seconds faster than last week. Emma beamed, tossing Shadow his reward, a specialized training toy designed to withstand his powerful jaws. He's getting better at differentiating scents, too. Yesterday, he identified the chemical traces from almost a mile away. The quarterly evaluations had evolved from simple assessments into comprehensive training sessions that the entire family participated in. Lancaster had been true to his word. Shadow remained with them, his official status as a military working dog on specialized civilian assignment, providing legal protection and resources that had transformed their lives. Sarah emerged from the house, clipboard in hand, Shadow's midday meal is prepared, and don't forget we have the community presentation at 2 o'clock. The community presentation represented perhaps the most remarkable change in their lives. Following Shadow's hearing before the county board, a tense affair where Emma had delivered impassioned testimony about his protective nature in the family, had revealed his military status. Public perception had shifted dramatically. Tom Reeves, once their most vocal opponent, had become their staunchest ally after Shadow located his lost 4-year-old grandson during a blizzard. Now, the Millers regularly conducted educational sessions about working dogs, with Shadow as the ambassador. Schools, community centers, even the regional police academy had requested demonstrations. Shadow's disciplined behavior and extraordinary capabilities had transformed him from feared outsider to local celebrity. Inside the house, Shadow's recovery journey was documented in photographs lining the hallway, his first steps after surgery, the rehabilitation exercises, his triumphant return to full mobility. The knife wound had left a visible scar across his hindquarters, but it had healed without complication, just as Lancaster had predicted. "I still can't believe how much our lives have changed," Sarah remarked as she prepared Shadow's specialized diet. "A year ago we were fighting to keep him, and now the military is funding a training facility on our property." Ethan nodded, watching through the window as Emma led Shadow through his cool-down exercises. Lancaster saw the potential in their partnership, and having Shadow work with local search and rescue satisfies the continued service requirement. The arrangement had indeed worked to everyone's advantage. Shadow's abilities were regularly utilized by regional emergency services for search and rescue operations. While Emma had discovered her own talent for dog training, her college applications now included essays about her experience rehabilitating Shadow, and several prestigious veterinary programs had expressed interest as they prepared for the community presentation. A familiar black SUV pulled into their driveway. Colonel Lancaster, now a regular visitor, stepped out in civilian clothes, accompanied by a man in a wheelchair. "They're early," Sarah commented, glancing at her watch. Emma brought Shadow inside, his demeanor changing instantly upon seeing Lancaster not tense, but attentive, recognizing an authority figure from his developmental training. "Emma, Sergeant Miller, Mrs. Miller." Lancaster greeted them formally. "I hope you don't mind the early arrival. There's someone I'd like Shadow to meet before the public session." He gestured to the man in the wheelchair. "This is retired Master Sergeant Michael Brennan, formerly of the K-9 Special Operations Unit." Brennan's weathered face broke into a smile as Shadow approached, sniffing curiously at the wheelchair. "He's the spitting image of Duke," the veteran remarked, his voice rough with emotion. Same intelligent eyes. "You knew Duke?" Ethan asked, extending his hand to the fellow veteran. "Trained him for his first 2 years," Brennan confirmed, shaking Ethan's hand firmly despite his seated position. "Before he was reassigned to your unit. Best dog I ever worked with until the injury took me out of service." The revelation created an instant bond between the two veterans. As they moved to the living room, Brennan shared stories of Duke's early training days, his intelligence, his stubborn streak, his unwavering loyalty, while Shadow sat attentively between them, as if absorbing the history of his lineage. "When Lancaster told me about Shadow, about what happened with Marlene's operation, I had to meet him," Brennan explained. "See for myself what Duke's legacy became." Emma, who had grown more confident in social situations since Shadow entered her life, asked the question that had lingered for months. "Have you seen Duke since? Is he still alive?" A shadow crossed Brennan's face. "Duke retired from the breeding program last year. His age was catching up to him." "Where is he now?" Ethan asked quietly. Lancaster exchanged glances with Brennan before answering. "He's at our facility in Virginia. Comfortable. But—" He hesitated. Military working dogs sometimes struggle with full retirement. They're purpose-bred, mission-oriented. Without that structure, they can decline rapidly. "He's depressed," Brennan said bluntly. "Lost without a mission or a handler. It happens to the best of them." The information hung heavily in the room. Shadow, sensing the emotional shift, moved to Emma's side, pressing against her leg in silent support. "Actually," Lancaster said after a moment, "that's partly why we came early today. I have a proposition for your family." The proposition was unexpected, but somehow perfectly fitting. Would the Millers consider adopting Duke, giving the retired military dog a final home where he could live out his years with his offspring and a handler who had once been his partner? "The paperwork is already prepared," Lancaster explained. "Given the success of Shadow's placement and your family's demonstrated ability to handle specialized military canines, approvals have been expedited." "Bah!" For Ethan. The opportunity to reunite with his former partner, the dog he had believed dead for years, was overwhelming. For Emma, the chance to know Shadow's father represented a completion of the circle that had begun with that fateful adoption. "When can we meet him?" Sarah asked, practical as always despite her obvious enthusiasm. "He's here," Lancaster replied. "In the vehicle. We wanted to gauge your interest before introducing him." The reunion between Ethan and Duke unfolded in their front yard, away from the distraction of others. The aging German shepherd emerged from Lancaster's vehicle slowly, his muzzle grayed, his gait stiff from old injuries and arthritis. For a moment, he simply stood surveying the unfamiliar surroundings until his nose caught Ethan's scent. The transformation was immediate. Duke's ears pricked forward, his posture straightening despite his physical limitations. Ethan knelt in the grass, his voice breaking as he called his former partner's name. Duke's recognition was unmistakable. He moved to Ethan with increased vigor, pressing his head against the veteran's chest in a gesture so familiar it brought tears to everyone watching. Years of separation dissolved in that moment of reconnection, handler and dog, reunited by circumstances neither could have imagined. The introduction between father and son came next, carefully supervised by both Lancaster and Brennan. Shadow approached the older dog with unusual deference, his body language communicating a respect that seemed to transcend ordinary canine interaction. Duke inspected his offspring thoroughly, his aged amber eyes reflecting what almost appeared to be pride. By afternoon, when the community members arrived for the scheduled presentation, the Millers had a new story to share, one of completion, of family reunited, of second chances. Duke watched from a comfortable bed as Shadow and Emma demonstrated their training routines, the older dog's presence adding depth to their narrative about the extraordinary bonds formed between humans and their canine companions. "This is what it's all about," Brennan commented to Lancaster as they observed the demonstration. "Not just the capabilities, but the connections. The program succeeded because of this, not despite it." Lancaster nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps we've been measuring success incorrectly all along." As twilight descended on the Miller property, the family gathered on their porch, watching the two German shepherds explore the yard together, Shadow adapting his pace to accommodate his father's more limited mobility, Duke occasionally demonstrating a training technique with surprising energy. "I never thought I'd see him again," Ethan said softly, his hand finding Sarah's, "when they told me he didn't make it out of that ambush." "Some things are meant to be," Sarah replied, leaning against his shoulder, "like finding Shadow at that shelter, like Emma overcoming her fear." Emma, perched on the porch railing, smiled as she watched Shadow guide Duke around the property, showing him the boundaries, the safe places, the world that would now be his home, too. "Remember when we thought Shadow was just a weird-looking puppy?" she laughed. "And now look at a specialized training facility, military contracts, 2 extraordinary dogs, and 1 extraordinary daughter," Ethan added, who saw something in Shadow that the rest of us missed at first. As darkness fell, Shadow and Duke returned to the porch, settling at the family's feet with synchronized sighs of contentment. The younger dog positioned himself protectively between his family and the darkened property, while Duke leaned against Ethan's leg, closing his eyes in peaceful security. Whatever Shadow had been bred to be, whatever purpose the military had envisioned for him, he had found his true calling in this family, not as a weapon or an asset, but as a bridge between worlds, military and civilian, father and daughter, past and future. His journey from mysterious puppy to beloved family guardian had transformed not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. And in that transformation lay the greatest revelation of all, that the most extraordinary capabilities mean nothing without love to give them purpose. Shadow and Duke's story reminds us that even in our golden years, second chances await. Like Duke, many of us carry invisible wounds, the loss of purpose after retirement, the ache of disconnection from what once defined us. We understand what it means to feel set aside, our contributions forgotten. But Shadow teaches us that our greatest purpose might not be what we were bred for, but what we choose to become. When Ethan reunited with the partner he thought lost forever, he discovered healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means incorporating it into a new beginning. For those of us who've lost spouses, careers, or physical abilities, Duke's journey from depression to renewed purpose resonates deeply. We too can find meaning in unexpected places, forge new connections that honor our experience while embracing change. The Miller family created something beautiful by accepting these extraordinary dogs exactly as they were, scars, complications, and all. This is the gift we can both give and receive in our mature years, the recognition that our value isn't diminished by age or limitation, but transformed into something perhaps even more precious than before. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.